Okay, so we're going to have a look at Elizabeth's foreign policy and have a think about, first of all, what the aims were. We're going to start, first of all, by looking at Elizabeth's foreign policy towards France and Spain, so the big foreign powers. And then we will have a look at Elizabeth's foreign policy in terms of Scotland and Ireland. Now, the first thing to say with foreign policy is that actually, in terms of evaluating its success or failure, you have to consider what the aims were. And ultimately, the aims don't really change. They're quite general, and Elizabeth is no different to the other Tudors in this. So in effect, what's the first most important thing that any monarch needs to do when it comes to foreign policy? Quite simply, it's making sure that there is no risk of invasion. So preventing being invaded, preventing being controlled by a foreign power. Now, if we reflect on what's happened previously, in terms of invasion, we've only had the incursion of the Scots into England under Henry VII and under Henry VIII. Obviously, we've had more serious in terms of the idea of being controlled by a foreign power. That's where the concerns came with Mary's marriage to Philip. The idea of, is England ostensibly being controlled by Philip for, in the interest of Spain and the imperial empire? But ultimately, the threat of invasion was not something that was keenly felt. That's going to change when we're looking at Elizabeth. The second idea is that, perhaps more positive, how can foreign policy be used to further English interests? Now, most commonly that comes under economic. Think back to Henry VII and the embargo with the Burgundy and the damage to the cloth trade. Now, as we know from what was labelled the mid-Tudor crisis, economically, the Tudor England is not in a great place when Elizabeth becomes queen. So foreign policy could be an opportunity to actually improve the economic position of England, and that has to be a good thing. But generally, something which is the case for Elizabeth, as it was for the Henrys and Mary and Edward, is that really England isn't that big a player. It can never compete with France and Spain for importance. And that's something which Elizabeth seems a bit more aware of than certainly in the case of Henry VIII, who, as we know, saw himself as the Renaissance prince who could rise up to the levels of his compatriots in France and in Spain. Now, again, in terms of the assumptions of foreign policy and what would be expected of Elizabeth, it's the idea that England's natural enemy is France. France has a relationship with Scotland, the old alliance, and the assumption is that France would constantly look to try and exploit that. Now, the objective of English foreign policy has to be to try and restrict the French and their opportunity towards England by actually making friends with Burgundy. Burgundy meaning the Netherlands, and obviously there's economic benefits of that, but also the idea of preventing the French or the Spanish gaining a foothold in Burgundy, meaning that England would in effect be encircled. So England is going under Elizabeth to focus on protecting the independence of the Netherlands, which has and will continue to be targeted by the Holy Roman Empire as in Spain, and also France as well. Now, the problem for Elizabeth in terms of relations with Burgundy is that the Netherlands, Burgundy, the ruler is actually the King of Spain. And Philip, not only is he the King of Spain, but Philip is a devout Catholic. So there is religious issues here which could potentially come to the fore. On the other hand, though, there is no suggestion here that Philip is looking to challenge England or actively looking for a negative relationship with England, because he saw England as useful in curtailing the potential ambitions of France. But that can't be something that could be completely counted upon. If Philip, for example, turns against England, and potentially he could do because he is a Catholic and Elizabeth is creating what is effectively a Protestant nation, if Philip turns against England, he can use the trade with the Netherlands, with Burgundy, as an opportunity to cut that off, which would be hugely damaging for England. And obviously the worst case scenario possible would be some kind of Catholic alliance between Spain and France, possibly using the Netherlands as a launch pad to actually bring down England. Remember, going right back to the break from Rome, England is still the most powerful Protestant power in Europe. So although, as I've said, England is not comparable to France and Spain in terms of its size, wealth and importance, in terms of religion, it can be seen as the centre of European Protestantism, and as a result, there is the potential of being, called upon as an almost crusade, to use that term, against England. So that's something which is going to be a real concern. And there is constant theory, there's constant concern across this period that Spain and France are becoming closer, and that Spain and France might aim to actually challenge Elizabeth's rule and look to bring down England as a Protestant nation. And that is obviously going to be something which is going to be of real concern. And all of that together means that logically it makes sense for Elizabeth to pursue a Protestant alliance system to counter the idea of the assumed threat from the potential of a Catholic combination against England. Now, in terms of how foreign policy is decided, there is no challenge to Elizabeth's prerogative powers, even though she's a woman, etc. The prerogative powers, of course, meaning that the choice and the decision-making lies with the monarch. However, it's also important to note that there is a great deal of pressure on Elizabeth. There's the advice put towards her, and an expectation that advice will be listened to and ideally followed, because Elizabeth, of course, is not experienced in diplomacy. Now, a great example of the limitations of those seeking to influence Elizabeth, of course, is when it comes to marriage. Definitely the wise counsel put towards Elizabeth was that marriage was something that she should pursue for the protection of England. And we know that despite, or you may not know, but you will hopefully after this video, the idea that Elizabeth actually is not pursuing a marriage with the zeal and the determination that the councillors would expect to. They think it needs to be done, but there's also the view that, of course, getting the right marriage is so important because you can only do it once. There's no, Henry VIII Mark II expected when it comes to Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth, of course, even at the start of her reign, talks about the virtue, the value of being unmarried in terms of the lack of influence over her. But of course, that is not considered to be something which is likely to happen in the long term. Now, when Elizabeth comes in, probably the most likely match is between Elizabeth and Archduke Charles, who is a Habsburg. And that, of course, would keep Philip II happy and give a potential ally against France. So there is the potential of that, but the council are divided on it, and there is understandably concern that would be a bit of a Mary Mark II in terms of potential influence over Elizabeth. And there is, from several people within the council, there is a view that it would be better if it is an Englishman. However, who that Englishman would be means that we have the problem of whoever is married to Elizabeth seizing a position of power, which is in many ways a threat to the very sanctity of the throne. Now, Elizabeth's favoured candidate is supposedly Robert Dudley, but Robert Dudley is married, and when his wife, who is ill, falls down the stairs. The rumours surrounding the potential of Robert Dudley being involved in that, of which we don't have any concrete proof, but that's enough to scotch that as possibility. And in fact, nobody really sees within the council Robert Dudley being a wise choice, especially Cecil, who's very keen to ensure that Elizabeth keeps a wide berth from Dudley as a potential candidate. However, Dudley still has influence over Elizabeth, even though the marriage does not come to pass. She does have a relationship with Dudley, which we could say gives him potentially an influential position over the decision that she goes on to make. Now, moving on to the actual nuts and bolts of foreign policy. As I said, the assumption is that England's natural enemy is France, and when Elizabeth inherits England following the death of her sister Mary, England is actually at France. Remember, England has lost Calais. Mary said that, you know, Calais is written on her heart, etc. And it was humiliating, and this was put very firmly at the door of the relations with Spain. So there's pressure to stay away from Spain, and there is an assumption that something needs to be done to move away from the current situation. Now, there were peace negotiations, Casa Cambresi, between England, France and Spain. England's position isn't strong, and there is concern that France might actually question whether Elizabeth is legitimate on the throne. You know, going back, she is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, remember, and Anne Boleyn is under the legislation of Mary. Anne Boleyn is not a legitimate queen. And there is the awkward case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary, Queen of Scotland, is married to Francis, who is the heir to the French throne. So there is a prospect of this idea of potentially Mary becoming Queen of France and then looking to be Queen of England and Queen of Scotland. And, you know, imagine the power of that union. Doesn't come to pass because actually Henry II of France is really quite cautious, and rather than looking to push the claims of Mary as a potential alternative to Elizabeth, he actually wants to secure peace, mainly because he's actually worried about what Suleiman the Magnificent is threatening in terms of the threat of Turkey. So that kind of comes to Elizabeth's aid in some ways. How France feels, how Henry feels about England, is interesting because it gets contested. On the one hand, there is the fact that there is this quite conciliatory approach from France towards England, even to the point where, although they don't give Calais back, why would they? They put forward this idea that France would keep Calais for 8 years, upon which point either Calais would be returned to England, or they would pay England compensation for the loss of Calais. Now, of course, it doesn't happen. It's complete nonsense. But the fact that a treaty is signed, ending the war between France and England, is positive on the one hand, but also, unfortunately, fuels even more the fear that this sort of rapprochement, this better relations between the powers, could ultimately see France and Spain becoming closer and acting against England in a sort of a religious crusade against Protestantism. So there are very real fears here, but ultimately what prevents this from becoming something which is of greater concern is that Spain, Philip, is still very much interested in England and potentially looking at Elizabeth as a possible bride himself. So, you know, the idea of Spain chucking that away for a union with their enemy France is unlikely. But there is anxiety about it, especially when there is some claims from historians that you know, Henry had been very open about the idea that were he able to, he would be keen to invade and punish England for moving towards the Protestant way of worship. Now, in 1559, we see some events of great importance. There's two, really. In Scotland, we have a rising against the French regent of Scotland, Mary of Guise, and she's Catholic. And the rising comes from a group called the Lords of the Congregation, who are a very powerful, they're Protestant Calvinist faction, influenced by a guy called John Knox, who is a very extreme Protestant, and they look to rise up against the Catholic regent. Now, if they're able to, if England were to be able to help this Protestant faction gain Scotland, that would be of huge benefit, because in effect that would be moving France out of Scotland and ideally meaning an end to the old alliance and massively improving England's security. The other aspect in this is that Henry II dies, so Francis II becomes King of France. His wife is Mary, meaning that we have the unfortunate situation from England's point of view of having so this union is of great concern, because they actually, Mary Queen of Scots and Francis II, start using a coat of arms, which includes the English royal arms, France and Scotland. It's a clear demonstration, or certainly it gives the impression that they are actively looking to challenge the position of Elizabeth as Queen of England, never mind the idea of Scotland having any sort of independence. So this feeds into the idea of it being viewed as a religious clash. But England's council is divided, especially those who are left over from Mary. Arundel, Winchester, Petre were against the idea of any sort of intervention in the affairs of others. The main supporter who did feel that England should get involved was William Cecil. Cecil believed that the time was right to take advantage of the weakness of France, of the Guises, and to support the Scots. And, you know, the idea of how Mary was behaving, Mary and Francis, was enough to certainly turn Elizabeth to feeling the same way. And in short, what we end up seeing is that the action of the English forced the French to actually come to negotiate with England, and the Treaty of Edinburgh means that both French and English troops withdraw from Scotland. So this is seen as a great success. Although France is a threat to England, even if just temporarily, the intervention in Scotland is viewed as that success. So that threat of France being significantly diluted. So this is undoubtedly progress and an early bit of success in the reign of Elizabeth.